Hey everybody, so welcome to the VGF Strat Corner podcast. I am Scott, aka Zhang, on the boards. So this is going to be the last T6 episode. For this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the Bears, Kuma and Panda. This episode is a little bit of an oddity, so I do want to give a little bit of an introduction before I started. So first, I'm doing this solo. So there's no guest, there's no co-host or anything like that, which is a first for the podcast series. And I'm sure that there's going to be people that are a little disappointed at that. It's one of the main reasons I didn't try to put this episode up on the front page of TZ. If you're listening to this, chances are you're either subscribed to the YouTube channel or the Facebook page or something like that. So that's also why it's been so long since the last episode. I have reached out to a few people about the Bears, and there was actually one player in particular that I had been going back and forth with for the last probably 3 or 4 weeks or so, and it just didn't work out. There's no one to blame. Sometimes schedules just don't overlap. That's just how it is. We try to get guests on the podcast and stuff, and unfortunately, this is the one time that it has failed for me to get somebody else. So, unfortunately, that's just how it is. So, that being said, I do know a little bit about the Bears, but not nearly as much as someone who mains them, obviously. So, despite all the research I've done and the vids that I've watched, please forgive me if I miss something important or make an error like that. To be honest, if I hadn't already made the promise that I would get at least one episode for every character for T6, I probably would have just skipped this episode since Tag 2 is literally a week away. But I do keep my promises, and I'll make the exact same promise for Tekken Tag 2 that we'll get at least one episode for every character. So, second, this episode probably won't be too insanely long since it's not really a discussion or back and forth or anything. It's just me talking. But in addition to the T6 talk, at the end I'll throw in a little bit of the Tag 2 changes that I know about and how that might change the way that you play Bears if it changes at all. So just kind of keep that in mind. Third, it'll probably be a little while before the next episode, and there's a few reasons for this. Because of the DLC issues and whatnot, I do want to give the game at least a few weeks for the American player community to get a feel for it before we start talking strategy. Also, I initially thought that I might be able to occupy the downtime with a tutorial episode or something like that, but for anyone who's been paying attention to the front page or anything like that on TZ, Level Up has already taken up that torch, and they've done a great job with it, so there's really no need for me to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Luckily, the game has been played enough around the world that I think we can do some of the more popular characters and more well-known characters like the Mishimas without having to wait too long. But I just want to give that disclaimer because I don't want people to be surprised when there isn't another episode for 3 or 4 weeks or so. So just keep that in mind. So lastly, and this is something that I announced on the Caliber podcast as well. Expect some neat updates to this podcast series and these episodes in the future. Because I finally went out and got some capture equipment. Uh, Again, finally, it's been a long time overdue, and so I can finally record feed from my PS3. So in addition to being able to have something for you to watch if you're listening to these through YouTube, but I'm also going to see if my guests would be willing to play me in a few matches, so you can kind of sort of see their words in action. It should be fun. I'm really stoked for it, and I know there's actually been quite a few people who have asked, "Hey, why don't you have a video or game footage or something while you guys are talking and whatnot?" So I'm trying to do that and get that going. So, expect that in the future. It should be a lot of fun. I'm not taking away the MP3s, the direct downloads for anyone who just wants the audio, and the episodes will not be geared towards the footage. The footage is just going to be supplementary, so you don't have to worry about needing to watch the video in order to listen to the episode. So, just keep that in mind. It should be a lot of fun. So, can't wait to get to that. So enough with all that. Let's talk about some bears. By the way, if I say he, I mean both Kuma and Panda. I think that you see far more Kuma than you do Panda. But as far as I'm aware, there's no difference between the two, like an Eddie or Christy. So I just kind of say he on reflex. So anyway, let's start with a generalized statement of strengths and weaknesses like we usually do. Kuma is widely considered a turtle character. So with that being said, with every character you can pick your moments and be aggressive, but there is no real safe rush down with him, like there is, say, a Steve. Kuma just doesn't have those tools. His strength lies mostly in spacing and punishing, and that's both block and with. So I mean, just keep that in mind when you're playing them, trying to pick them up. So since being a turtle character revolves around punishing, we might as well start with the punishers. So for the standing punishers, at -10, he has 2-1 or forward 1. I do have the game turned on, so I can kind of fact check myself as I go. 2-1, it's okay. I mean, it does 25 damage. It gives you frames, and then if you want to, you can continue on the string by doing 2-1-2 or 2-1-3. Now, keep in mind none of that's guaranteed, but it's just an extra something. If you feel like you want to play off of your opponent's knowledge, weakness, or something like that. So at -12, he has down back 2-1. Which is a high mid, 37 damage. It's mostly used in bounder or in juggles to bound. So just kind of keep that in mind. But it's a really good 12 frame punisher. Every once in a while, you will see people throwing that out, just kind of willy-nilly, see if they can catch somebody, because it gives him a pretty decent advantage on hit. So that's always good. -13 is forward 2-1, and that's really good. It does 38 damage. You can hit confirm the 1. So keep that in mind. It also does wall splat, and just the fact that it's 13 frames as opposed to maybe an Armor King shoulder, which is 14 frames or something like that. It's pretty good. And even if it doesn't, even if you're not near a wall, I mean, it does knock down, so you can always kind of take advantage of that. But it does knock pretty far away, so you're not going to get like insane Oki or anything like that. And then at -15 frames, he doesn't have a like a down forward 2 or anything, but most people do down forward 2-1, which is also referred to as Bear Twin Pistons, or BTP, which I'll probably say quite a few times. So good range, good damage, leads to a good juggle. So just like you would think of Heihachi's old TP that launches, it's mid, so very very good. For the while standing punishers, at -11, he has while standing 4, nothing too special, but his while standing 4, it does do more damage than your typical while standing 4. It does 24, I believe. Let me double check here. Yep, 24 damage. So it's not great, but certainly not bad. And then with that in mind, I mean his legs are short, which I'll probably mention again. So you're not going to be able to quite punish at the range that a lot of other characters while standing for will, but it's still there, which is better than nothing. At -13, pretty good. He has a while standing 1-1, which it does knock down, does 36 damage, but because it's an arm, he has pretty decent range on it. He also has you can just do the while standing 1 if you want to and not continue it. But obviously most people are going to go for the damage, and then because of the way that it knocks down, it does give him good Oki options. He does have a while standing 1-2, but it's not guaranteed. So you'll have to take that with a grain of salt. At -15, he has while standing 2, which is just a standard launcher. So he'll get juggle damage and whatnot off of that. So okay, so that's all the punishers, and then at -16, of course, from while standing, if you want to, you can crouch cancel and then do down forward 2-1. So almost all of these punishers, they also sub as great with punishers, but keep in mind that a lot of them are punishable on block, thus the reason that you have to use them almost exclusively as punishers. But luckily they all do really good damage, and like I mentioned, you have stuff like forward 2-1, which knocks down, or in a lot of cases wall splats if you're near the wall, so it's always good. While standing 1-1, 36 damage, knocks down, so not only are you getting a healthy chunk, but you're also getting that Oki mix up. So, always keep that in mind. So, a lot of these, in addition to damage, once you start getting to the 15 frames, you're looking at juggles. So, talking about his juggles, his damage is just good outside of the Punishers as well, regardless. So if we take a look at his launchers, damage is I actually would consider it average if you take into consideration all of his juggles starters. So hop kick and just everything. But if you take a look at some of the specific ones, he gets really beastly damage, like forward 4-2, for instance. I know a lot of people love that move. Heihachi has it as well, but that's going to give you 80 plus with a really, really simple, easy bread and butter combo. Hunting bear stance, or HBS, which is a 3+4. If you go into that stance and do 1+2, if you happen to hit that, it's kind of, because you have to go into stance and then do the move. It's hard to hit sometimes, but off of that, you're looking at the same sort of types of damage. As an added bonus, although Kuma is considered big, he floats awkwardly. So if your opponent doesn't account for that, you might be seeing some dropped combos. It's not for the jab happy characters, like a Nina, Law, stuff like that. It's not insanely prevalent, but there are characters that have problems doing regular juggles. In awkward situations, like if you take, for instance, like an Armor King, it's a little harder to float him and then get to the giant swing, for those who are familiar with Armor King combos. So, it's not something that you're going to see a lot of, but just because of his upper body, he's real top heavy. So when he gets knocked up in the air, he just kind of floats weird. So, again, it's not something that's like drastically game changing, but just a little bonus if you're playing Kuma. And kind of along the same lines, it's a little off topic, but I'm going to throw it out there, just because. One thing that you also have to notice, that's a sort of a counterbalance to what I just mentioned. Because he is so big, his lateral movement, the sidestepping movement, that's not nearly as good as pretty much every other character in the game. Much like Jack, you don't sidestep a ton because he's so big and he's so wide that he can't get around a lot of moves that other characters can. So whenever you see Kuma players, you'll notice sidesteps because that's just part of the natural movement of Tekken, but it's far more going to be backdash focused than sidestepping. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of things that you're not going to be able to sidestep that other characters will be able to because you're so fat. So, just keep that in mind. So anyway, his launchers, by and far, just kind of keep in mind that they are not safe. Like I mentioned, certain things like forward 4-2 can be safe or safe-ish. It's technically -20, I believe, but has really, really good pushback. So if your character can't get, or if your opponent can't get to you off the block, then it's perfectly fine. Or I would say, even in a situation where the character is only going to get jabs or something off of that being blocked, the risk reward is still in his favor. So it's still something that, even though it's negative, he's getting so much reward off of it that it's still something that you'll probably want to do. But just the fact that his launchers aren't safe, like BTP and Hopkick, blah, 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 list goes on. But, it's part of the reason that it's hard to attempt any sort of rush down with the Bears. You might be looking at some good damage, but there's no generic down forward 2 launcher or anything like that he can spam. And he also doesn't have that really scary counter hit launcher, like a Magic 4 or Steve's Back 1 that you really have to fear. So he has some counter hit tools. Don't get me wrong; we'll get into that here in a minute. But he's not a launch spammer by any means. So just kind of keep that in mind. It builds into this defensive style where he has the launchers, he has the damage off of the launchers, but you have to play defensive. You have to wait for those whiffs. So that being said, he's actually not too bad of a poker. Since we were just talking about launchers, especially from low poking. Even though he's got the launcher problem, he has one of the more annoying pokes in the game with down back 2, which has good range, good damage. Has really good crushability going under highs and whatnot. But it tracks terribly, and that's really the only downside of it. Given frames, not a ton, but it frames is still frames. Forward 1 is, of course, one of the most spammable moves that he has. It's a showstopper, if you will. 2-1 is a great poke, mid-high, and has, as I mentioned earlier, has the 2 different follow-ups that you can do if you choose the 2-1-3 or the 2-1-2. So that's always something that you can do. Going back to the lows, down back to, I already mentioned, but he can be tricky with his stances. More importantly, his bear hell sweep. You can't really forget about that move. It's right on that border of seeable and not seeable, so it's always worth a try or two to see if your opponent can react to it. Down back 3 is a safe option, and it's actually one of my favorite moves with bear, but it doesn't have any special properties like crushing or anything like that. HBS lows can be a bit tricky, but are risky if your opponent is good at sniffing them out. So just kind of keep that in mind. But this is actually one of the critiques of Bears and why his rushdown isn't the best, because he has a hard time making people duck. I mean, once you can see Hell Sweep, all he's got are pokes and grabs. All of the lows, regardless of how good you think they are, out of HBS, I mean, the fact is you still have to go into HBS. So it's even if you're looking at trying to use a mix-up out of that, you're it's probably going to be an Oki thing because you have to get into hunting stance. So just kind of keep that in mind. Let's see. I think that's it for the pokes. You can do the down forward 1 string if you want to. That's pretty decent. But I mean, don't expect him to have like a Miguel, down forward 1. It's nothing like that. So that's it. That's all I can think of for that. But all of these, believe it or not, all these pokes that I mentioned it already, they help a lot with the Zoki game, which is actually pretty decent. Surprisingly, he has 2 safe options that will hit grounded, down back 3 and back 1. Most characters, are hard pressed to find just one move that is both safe and hits grounded. So this is definitely a plus for him. Not to mention down back 3 in a very weird manner if you're not used to seeing it. It floats for a down forward 2 follow-up. So if you happen to hit him trying to stand up, you can get that down forward 2, which then you can continue into Moroki since it resets the options. So he has other float or rebound options that you can do if you want to, like doing just a naked down forward 2-1 or a down back 1-2. But remember, they're not safe and they don't hit grounded or anything like that. So you got to keep that in mind. He has even more options in the situation or the situation that you're going to see most often when your opponent is able to tech roll. So if you get them in a position and you float them where the opponent has the option to tech, it's not a slam down or anything like that. The options break down like this. If they tech roll, the back 1+2 or the back 12 unblockable will catch. If they roll back, you can run up and get a free bear twin pistons. If they try to stand straight up, you can do the down back 3 that I mentioned into a float. And then, you do the down forward 2 follow-up or whatever, and you get to reset your Oki. Or if they stay grounded, you can do the back 1 or the down 3. Or you can do the back 12 unblockable into the roll. So keep in mind, the roll is obviously slower than the other 2 options, so, you kind of got to factor that in. But regardless, his options are not bad at all. And, people eat that unblockable lots. I mean, even if you look at, start watching the tag stuff, it's still in there, which I'll talk about a little later. But, it's one of those things where he's kind of scary when you do that. I mean, the fact that he's getting an unblockable for tech rolling sucks for you if you end up tech rolling. The roll does not do small damage by any means. It does a lot of damage, so you have to keep that in mind. Luckily, if you're playing against bear, the down back 3, even if you get even if he gets the float, it's less damage than the unblockable if you think of it that way. So always something to consider. But back one is pretty hefty damage, so you can't really sit there for it. Usually it's best just to eat the down back three unless that's going to kill you or anything like that. So real quick too, remember that the bears have additional moves when they are fully grounded, like Craig. So like if they're on their belly or on their back, play dead, or I can't remember the other position, but what it's called. But so you can mess around with those if you want, kind of to flip the script a little bit. If you want to mess with your opponent's Oki, you have that option. So it's sometimes, if people aren't familiar with the matchup, they forget about this sort of stuff. Craig players I know love to use that. And there's no reason for you as a bear player not to use it. And if you watch videos, you'll see it on occasion. So definitely don't underrate it. But I kind of mentioned walls earlier, so we should probably talk about that a little bit. He doesn't have your typical string or jab carry, like a Law or a Bruce. But luckily, Bear Twin Pistons BTP launches pretty high and far, so that's a good ender before bound to try to get your opponent to the wall. To get that high wall splat. Damage is going to depend on the situation, of course, but just like every character, I mean, he's going to take off some massive chunks once he gets you to the wall. I actually think he's really exceptional at wall splats because off of a wall splat, like a forward 2-1, you can do back, a small back dash, a 2 jab, and then down forward 3-2 to bound, and then up forward 3-4, 12. So off of forward 2-1, you're looking at 90 damage. And I know some characters can get more than that, but you figure, 90 plus damage off of a 13 frame Punisher is pretty scary. And a lot of characters, when you get to that range, you're usually looking ranges in close to the wall. You're usually scared of like a negative 14 or so. That's usually when characters are getting their wall splats. But 13 frames, pretty rough. 90 damage. So I can't say that he's got a bad wall game at all. And then you get that Oki damage, or that Oki game that I was mentioning. And they can't roll back, so that's eliminating an option. And as we all know, the more options that you have, typically the better the character is going to be. So if you're eliminating an option from your opponent, it's always something to keep in mind. And then I actually didn't mention this in earlier when I was talking about it, but there's actually even a setup. It's pretty situational, but he can actually even get his fart off of a certain wall setup for practically for free. But if you tech roll it, it's instant death. So it's just something to keep in mind that his wall game is just as good as anyone else's. He gets crazy damage off of it. He has the Punishers to wall splat you. And stuff like that. So, honestly, that seems to be the theme for him throughout. His damage overall is pretty good, outside of the standard 10 frame punish and the wall standing 11 frame punish, which, even then, wall standing 4 does more damage than your average wall standing 4 punish. All of his punishers do good damage. Not everyone can boast of a 13 frame wall splatter, and wall standing 1-1 sets up nicely for that Oki mix up situation. But unless it's an ultra safe move like a forward 1 or a down back 3, which I consider ultra safe because it's low and it's safe, which is rarity, all of his most used moves are pretty chunky. Back 1 does a good chunk, it's in the 30s. Down back 2-1, forward 2-1, which I've mentioned quite a few times now, and just so on. So keep that in mind. But kind of along the theme of safety, which I sort of mentioned there and have mentioned quite a few times so far, we should probably chat about tracking, which is another component of safety. Overall, a lot of people complain from what I've seen about his tracking. I mentioned down back 2. Down back 2 is a staple of his move, like his pokes and his most used options, but down back 2 is very bad at tracking. So you're going to hear a lot of, you're going to hear a lot of people talking about that, kind of complaining about that, and so on. But at least for me, when you consider, all of his options and the way that you should be playing him, um, he's going to have moves that are going to be able to be stepped one way or the other, just like with every character. But if you consider that your playstyle is most likely going to be defensive, at least for me, in my mind, you shouldn't really have to worry too much about being stepped too often. Because most of the time when people are sidestepping, it's either a setup, like they're putting you in that weird frame range and they're expecting an attack, and then they sidestep your attack, or you're in rushdown mode and they're trying to get around a move. So since one of those, one of those two situations that I just mentioned, you're not going to run into very often because you're trying to whiff punish, and you're trying to set them up into situations where they can't really move and they just kind of have to eat your stuff. You don't have to really worry about that sort of sidestep. And then for the other one, I mean, that's going to happen to any character. Uh, if you get in a situation where you think that you can kind of sneak in a move there before they do something and they catch you, I mean, that's just in my mind, that's just a 50-50. That really doesn't have a lot to do with sidestepping per se. That just has more to do with them setting you up and guessing correctly. So, but for the sake of argument, let's say that you go on the offense a little bit, the offensive. Most of his moves out of HBS, for instance, track at least one direction, so that's good. Some standing moves like Bear Twin Pistons, Hell Sweep, they do the same. He does lack a quick tracking move, like say a Lars back 1, Fang back 4. He doesn't have that, which can pose a problem at times. But down forward 12, that's an option. It's a nice option, but it's not quick, so it's not an end all be all solution. But it's something. But just kind of keep that in mind, I guess, that when you're playing him, his tracking is okay. Down forward 1 is decent. 2, his regular 2 jab is okay, and if you do 2-1, that'll be decent tracking. But you're not going to find an option like back 1, or Lars's back 1 or Fang back 4 or something along those lines. So with that in mind, it just kind of reinforces this defensive element. But if you stick to that defensive element, I really don't think you're going to run into it too often. I mean, when you watch Bear players, they're very patient. They're waiting for that opportunity. And when they find that opportunity, there's not really much your opponent can do for just throwing, in the sense of just throwing out side steps or anything like that. So just kind of a little overview of the tracking. There's really not much more to say about it, but tracking also does bring up the key component of safety, which we've kind of danced around a little bit, but haven't taken a closer look at. As I started with, Kuma isn't a rushdown character, so although he has a lot of safe moves, they really don't complement a rushdown style. On top of that, most of his safe moves are high, or they're part of a string where you can duck at some point and punish, or even worse, they have the bad tracking that we mentioned. Forward 2-1, I've mentioned it a ton of times. It's a great example. It's an awesome move, but really, really crappy for pressure. Speaking of, a lot of his punishers are like that. I kind of, mentioned that earlier. While standing 1-1, it's -12 on block, down back 1-2. His standing 12 frame punish, that's -11 on block. But he does have safe options. I mean, they are there. Back 1 is a safe option. Great move, great damage, great range. It's mid and it hits grounded. It's just, a little on the slow side. It doesn't have the best tracking in the world. Another move that I've mentioned a couple times is down back 3. I actually think it's a really understated move. For Bear players, you're used to it because it's an Oki setup. But for anyone who isn't familiar with the Bears, this is a great move. You're not going to find a lot of characters with that kind of move. It's the low portion of the 2-1-3 string, but it's completely safe. It doesn't have any special properties like crushing, but safe lows are extremely hard to come by. And I mentioned it's good for wake ups, and not just for the floating. So let's say that you guess wrong, and it doesn't you throw it out and it's not a situation where you can catch them with it. It is completely safe, and some people might be looking for the low, so when they get up, they get up correctly and they get up in time to block it, so they block it, and then a lot of people might forget that it's safe, so they might try to punish it. And if you consider uh, you know Kuma has the wall standing 1-1, which is 13 frames, and a lot of people have really good 13 or 11 frame punishers. So it's always possible, if they don't know the matchup, that you might be getting a punish of your own, because a lot of those punishes, just like Kuma's, are not safe on block. You look at laws while standing 1-2, for instance. Obviously you can kind of do some stuff with laws while standing 1-2. It's a hit confirmable, etc. But it's still something that, if they're just trying to throw it out thinking that it's free, it might put you in a good position. So keep in mind, all of this is relative. It's always a wise decision to throw a move out and see how your opponent reacts. But for someone who knows the matchup, you're going to have to choose your moments wisely. As I've kind of beat it over the head as I keep talking, he's a defensive character. You have to know the matchups. And if your opponent knows Kuma or knows Bear, your already bad rush down gets even worse. So you kind of gotta keep that in mind. But on that, we're talking about defensive styles, defensive style play. So we should talk about panic buttons, because it is more about more than just backdashing and trying to create whiffs. If somebody's in your face, you got to have some sort of option. He's not the best with panic buttons, but he does have some options. They are there. Forward 1, as I mentioned earlier, it's been a staple for Kuma players forever, precisely because it has a tendency to stop a ton of moves dead in their tracks, and or catch someone in the air for a float. It's really good at floating people. It's not going to give you that retarded Magic 4 payoff, but if you're feeling snazzy, you can try predicting the counter hit and completing the other 2 hits. So it would be forward 1-1-1, which is the old Julia string, but he's had it forever as well, and that'll give you a juggle, but just know that you're going to eat some damage if you misjudge it, because it is both the second one and the third one of that string. Those are both launch punishable, so you do have to keep that in mind. In either case, I still don't think that you can downplay the fact that he has a 10 frame counter hit juggle starter. That's a rarity. There's a lot of characters that have 12 frames, some characters that have 11, not a whole lot that have 10. So anyway, he has a pretty decent amount of moves, I would say, that crush or go under other moves. Both hop kicks will crush lows. Down back 2 will crush high. The butt smash, which is down 12, that has a tendency to snuff things like jabs and a lot of highs. Same with back 3+4, which is the boot lift. And the low version of it, which is forward 3+4. But again, keep in mind those kinds of options, they are risky. So you will most likely be getting punished if they block it. Also, HBS goes under highs. Every once in a while, you'll see people advocating doing instant HBS 1+2 to try to go under jabs and then launch. So you wouldn't want to, I wouldn't say that you would want to use it as a crush per se, but more options are always good, and it has a really high payoff. So oddly enough, he does have a counter hit 4. Don't get me wrong, he does have a counter hit 4 which goes to a juggle, but it's not as magic as a lot of other characters like Bruce or Law or Nina or something like that. But if you manage to hit any of these panic buttons, he does get a good chunk. of damage plus Oki, and you always have the option with forward 1 to play it safe, not complete the string, and just take your frame advantage. So, I mean, just keep that in mind. You don't have to spam forward 111 as a panic button. You can just use forward 1, which a lot of high-level players do. So keep that in mind. Which reminds me, out of the forward 1, we haven't really touched on grabs yet, which are a big part of everything in Tekken, and that's no exception for the bear. R&R, Rock and Roll Circus, it's still bufferable out of everything, which is really nice. So let's say that you hit that F1, or the forward 1 that you've been fishing for. You can try to sneak an R&R after it. Or, and you can also use that, of course, as a mix-up to doing any of his other grabs, his regular 1 or 2 grab. Excuse me. He also has the headbutt as a secondary option to that. The headbutt does wall splat, so keep that in mind. If somebody's not looking for it or whatever at the wall, you can always do that. His regular throws are really good because they leave your opponent right there on the ground in front of him. So that down back 3 that we were talking about, you have those options as well as the other Oki options. There's no real unblockable option, so keep that in mind. But yeah, so kind of running out of topics. I think I've covered most of it so far. I should pay some lip service to his range, which I've kind of alluded to a little bit. It's a double-edged sword. He has great arm range, but bad leg range. But since most of what you'll be doing will be punches or using his arms, I would consider his range to be good. Plus, moves like down, back, 1-2, and Bear Twin Pistons have deceptively long range, especially Bear Twin Pistons. Hits way farther. At least to my eye, it seems like it hits way farther than it looks like. I should also mention a little bit more about his stances. Sit is pretty straightforward. You can do sit out of, you can do like a jumping sit up forward 3+4. If you want to do that way, you can just go straight and sit from down 3+4. Not a ton of options out of it, but as I'll mention here in a moment, the roll, you can roll out of sit by just tapping forward. So that he can do out of HBS as well. And I know a lot of people like the roll, and they like to do the roll mix-ups. So you do have that option. But other than that, it's pretty limited in what you can do. HBS is far more interesting. It's got more moves, and there's more of a mix-up game there, especially like I mentioned out of the roll. But even stuff like HBS down 1+2, which is the little jump. I'm sure even if you're not familiar with Bear, you've probably seen that move. It can really trick a player who doesn't know how to deal with it. And he also has tricky stuff like grounding himself, much like Lei. You just do down 3, down 4, or which will put you into the face-up position, or you can do down 3+4 to just go down onto his belly. And like I mentioned before, since he has moves from grounded, you can always mess with that. The down 3 and the down 4, he rolls to the side when he goes onto his back. So there is a little bit of an evasive element there. But like I've mentioned before, if your opponent knows the matchup, they're going to be able to snuff that stuff out before you can get any real damage. But it is there, and like I said, a lot of people like to do the roll mix-ups because you have the roll 4 and roll 3, and then roll 2, another launcher there. So it's stuff to play around with. And there are a lot of Bear players that like to use it, so I can't say that it's like irrelevant or anything like that. So with that, that's all I got. That's the end of my notes. Hopefully it's enough to get you started. I'm sure that there's stuff or some hidden strats out there that I don't know because I don't main Bear. But from what I can gather, watching vids, playing against Bear a little bit, the key to playing Bear is knowing your character matchups. Obviously, since you're going to be turtling a lot. Unless, of course, you're lucky enough to run into an opponent with absolutely no character knowledge of the Bears, which is certainly possible. And in that case, you can get away with murder. So it's that'll be a fun match for you. But in high level play, if you know the matchups, it's that turtling style. Tekken has always favored turtles, so he's perfectly viable. There are quite a few big name players out there that have been successful with him. Clint and Grimy Grizzly, just to name a couple. So he has plenty of tools to compete, and there are Korean bear players that have been doing well, especially with tag. I know that there are a couple high level bear players doing their thing. So with that being said, since I kind of opened the door there, let's take a look at some of the Tag 2 changes. Keep in mind, I don't have the game, obviously, so all I have to go on are vids and hearsay, meaning some of these might not be accurate, and I might not have everything that has changed. But anywho, here's a quick list of what I found so far. So one thing I know a lot of people are going to be excited about and they're going to love is that both bears can be used together. Because you have both Kuma and Panda available to select, you essentially don't need to play solo to play solo. In fact, I've heard from a couple bear players that that's exactly what they do. They pick both bears and they're just using it as an extra life bar, but they feel like they're just playing one character, which is exactly what you're doing. So I know a lot of people are going to like that. The tracking on back 12 unblockable changes a bit, so that back 12 3+4, which takes you into HBS, tracks better and is more reliable. So that's what everyone has switched to for Oki. So just keep that in mind once tag comes out. If you notice that the back 12 doesn't have the same tracking that it used to, that's why. More things can go into HBS in general, such as back one. Back one can now go into HBS. HBS itself got a few changes, including an auto parry. If you just hold forward and just start moving forward in HBS, auto low parries now. Generic hop kick got replaced with a hunting hawk type string that can go into HBS. For those who aren't familiar with hunting hawk, it's Huarong has it, as well as Heihachi. He has it as well. And from what I've seen so far, most people in tag are using it as a juggle filler. But it's there. So unfortunately, you don't have the old hop kick anymore. But beyond that, there's a lot of little stuff that they seem to have tweaked. Too much for me to really write down and research, but it seemed like it was all frame stuff. That's kind of pointless to go over right now, since none of us have the game and we're not talking about strategy. But what I can gather from vids and from chatter is that he got some new moves, but he got far more nerfs than he did buffs. But they're mostly little nerfs like the back 12 change, or other hitbox related stuff. Overall, it appears that his playstyle hasn't changed all that much, and that's what most people's opinions seem to be, is that you're going to play him in Tag 2 the exact same way that you did in BR, T6 BR. So the big change is going to happen with the tag mechanic, meaning that if you're a T6 player, you've never played Tekken Tag, the biggest change in his play for you is going to depend on who his partner is and how you use the tag option. Everything else is going to be as T6, same as T6, but that tag option, that tag mechanic, to speak, it's big. It does change the dynamic of how you play the game. So it's going to be interesting. I've watched some vids of him so far. It'll be crazy to see what some of the American bear players do with him, because for those who know Clint, he's played bear a lot, but it's one of those things. So who knows if he'll keep playing? He plays other characters. So, but anyway, so that's all I got. Thanks a lot, everyone, for listening. Again, sorry I couldn't get a guest, but hopefully I provided enough info that this was somewhat educational. So with that, I will see you guys next time, and enjoy Tekken Tag 2.